Bloomberg BusinessWeek. I'm Carol Massar.
And I'm Jason Kelly. We're here inside Bloomberg headquarters in New York.
This week, the attack on the world's largest oil processing plant in Saudi Arabia, rattling markets and raising tensions in the key energy exporting region.
Plus, a look at how Trump Care brought a new era of health insurance that doesn't cover the bills.
And BusinessWeek talks. We sit down with private equity titan Steve Schwarzman, who weighs in on the U.S.-China trade war.
They're doing it as they recognize that the short term in China can remain fine with policy adjustments, but they're borrowing from their future.
We'll have more of that conversation later on, but let's begin with this week's cover story. It's all about General Motors. CEO Mary Barra, she's eyeing a tech future, but her most pressing issue right now, she has a lot of workers on strike.
She does indeed, and that is one of a handful of deep dives into well-known global companies in this week's issue. Here's editor Joel Weber.
A cover story starts with General Motors. Maybe you've heard of them. Going through a little bit of labor strife right now with a first strike in 12 years. But yet there's a bigger story, and that's what our cover story is ultimately about.
And why now? I mean, better to be lucky than smart, maybe, but you're very smart to deep dive into Mary Barra, but nobody saw this strike coming.
We did. A couple weeks ago. But ultimately, this story is not about the strike. It just provides a convenient news hook. And this is, we talk about strategy stories a lot. And the Mary Barra story is ultimately a strategy story. This is a CEO that's trying to basically pivot her business and her business model and staff up with engineers and software people and pivot away from sort of the traditional auto model into an electrified version of the future that might also be automated as well.
Well, I think it's brilliant. I think about when she was making all those changes, right? Cutting back on brands and just saying, this is not an easy thing for a CEO to do, but she was thinking about, okay, what's the GM of tomorrow?
Yep, that's right. But at the same time, you have to deal with today. And that's where labor comes in. Yeah. And ultimately why we're going to be watching this strike unfold for a little bit longer.
Talk a little bit about Trump Care. That is a story that in some ways is sort of hard to read because it's a very human story in a lot of ways, the cost of healthcare, literally and figuratively. Yeah,
that's right. So one of the things that we've coined here is Trump Care, which is a play off of Obamacare, obviously. But what President Trump has really done is gut the ACA initiative that was such a flagship of President Obama's. And one of the things that's happened is a lot of shady insurance brokers have stepped into that void and basically brought to market a lot of policies that look like they do wonders, but the fine print reveals that they actually insure nothing. And that's left consumers holding the bag, in some cases hundreds of thousands of dollars, when they find themselves in circumstances that they thought they were insured for.
We talked to Zeke Vox about it. I feel like anybody who's got an insurance policy, they've got to be checking it out.
Yeah, you got to read the fine print. Yeah. And that's ultimately this was an incredible story because it digs into a place of reporting that no one's actually been looking, and consumers are absolutely being hurt right here.
All right. I want to talk about another great big corporate dive that you folks did this week. You're asking the question, why did Bayer buy Monsanto?
This is a fascinating M&A story. Bayer, incredibly well known for, creating aspirin long ago. And then Monsanto, which is known for Roundup, among other things, not beloved in the U.S. And, Bayer basically acquired them a year ago. And what we've seen since then is that they basically acquired a company that they didn't maybe know what the legal implications of these ongoing lawsuits were going to be. And we've just seen the number of lawsuits skyrocket, and it's left Bayer basically looking at this massive acquisition that they basically didn't do their due diligence on, even though they say they have.
Right.
Here's a stat that I thought was fascinating. The market cap of Bayer now was the exact price that they paid for Monsanto when they acquired it. So it really just shows how much this has hurt that company. Within the company, which is revered as a German industrial might, there's been a lot of soul searching about this and what it might mean for the company's future.
We'll have much more on those stories coming up. But first, we turn to a top global story this week, the attack on Saudi Arabia's oil processing plant, the largest in the world.
That attack rattling markets, raising tensions in the key energy exporting region, and raising questions about President Trump's strategy to weaken Iran. Here's managing editor for Russia, Africa, and the Middle East, Ben Harvey, in Tel Aviv with this week's remarks.
As we see in this, in the most recent attack on Saudi Arabia, what they've done is they've struck at the heart of the global energy infrastructure. This is the world's biggest refiner. When they attacked this Aramco site, with a single attack, they managed to knock out about half of Saudi Arabia's production and about 5% of global production.
That certainly was noticed, big deal, by the global stage, certainly by the energy markets. What I think is interesting, though, is how you talk about that the pressure, specifically by the United States, that has been put on Iran, it has certainly created havoc in their economy, but it has put them in kind of a powerful, Tehran, in a very powerful position. Explain that.
Yeah, Iran's economy is under massive stress, but for the past several decades, Iran has invested in these essentially non-state armies around the region. So whereas this is a pretty cost-effective investment for them, they invest in these non-state actors that are basically forces of disruption. And when Iran feels pressured, it can activate them, and as we saw in this attack in Saudi, create massive damage.
You talk specifically, though, in your story, you make reference to the art of war and asymmetrical warfare. This is exactly what Iran has been doing.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, Iran's main rival in the Middle East is Saudi Arabia. Iran cannot compete with Saudi Arabia on conventional ground. Saudi Arabia is the world's third biggest purchaser of military equipment after Russia and China. After the United States and China, it's significantly higher spender than Russia is. Iran can't compete with that, so instead what they are doing is investing in, as you say, asymmetrical warfare. So they have small forces that can create havoc, whether it's on global shipping lanes, whether it's in Iraq, whether it's on the border of Israel, and also now, of course, in Yemen, where they have essentially gained a foothold in the Arabian Peninsula, which is Saudi Arabia's backyard.
Coming up, he's one of the best-known names in the world of investing, having co-founded the private equity behemoth Blackstone.
And he's got a new book out. Our conversation with Steve Schwarzman, that's coming up next.
This is Bloomberg BusinessWeek. Welcome back to Bloomberg BusinessWeek. I'm Jason Kelly.
And I'm Carol Massar. Join us for Bloomberg BusinessWeek every day on the radio starting at 2 p.m. Wall Street time. You can also catch up on our daily show by listening to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, and at Bloomberg.com.
And of course, you can find us online at businessweek.com and through our mobile app. If you think about the all-important world of private equity, you're probably thinking about Steve Schwarzman. He, of course, was the co-founder of the private equity firm Blackstone back in the mid-1980s after he'd done essentially a very successful stint on Wall Street already.
Yeah, and he writes about his path, or what he calls a collection of inflection points that led him to who he is and where he is today. It's all in his new book. It's called What It Takes: Lessons in the Pursuit of Excellence.
We caught up with him for the latest edition of BusinessWeek Talks.
It's a different Wall Street. It's certainly a much more efficient Wall Street. It's a Wall Street that can mobilize much more capital. It's a world that has printed so much money, not just in the United States, but the deficits that have run, that it's easy to aggregate a lot of money to do a lot of things.
It feels like so much of what you've become and what you've created really does go back to those early days, first at DLJ briefly, and then obviously business school, but Lehman Brothers, that's where you were really forged in a lot of ways. Talk to us about that time, the lessons you took from that experience.
Well, Lehman was, at that point, fascinating place in the investment banking
But
world.
A difficult place.
I would say my first day at work, somebody walked out of the elevator and welcomed me and said, "You're very lucky to work here because nobody here will ever stab you in the back. Actually, they'll just walk right up to you and stab you in the front."
Well, there's a line in your book that you say Lehman, you write how your exit from Lehman had shown you Wall Street at its worst with everyone for themselves.
Yeah, Lehman got into financial trouble, and And my own view, and everybody at the firm would have a different view, is that the grown-ups didn't protect the institution. They were too worried that the CEO who got the firm in trouble would fire them if they sort of took him on. And as a result, the firm was sort of frozen, and we had mark-to-market loss in terms of our net worth, and so we were forced to sell the business because if it was discovered that the net worth had sort of gotten close to disappearing, then your ratings would go and the firm would collapse. So I looked at that, and this is a firm that was, I guess, about 150 years old, something like that, and say, how can this ever happen? And I never wanted anything like that to happen to anybody I was associated with. On the other hand, it was a fascinating place with fascinating people. It was before I joined, before there were any MBA classes. Right. So the people who worked there were like ex-CIA agents, somebody from the entertainment business, somebody from the oil patch. Everybody had a lot of different points of view, and it was a fascinating place. That's why I went to work there.
And you forged some incredibly important relationships as well, not the least of which, maybe among the most important, if not the most important, was with Pete Peterson. You guys come out of that experience sort of scarred in different ways to a large extent. You start having breakfast every morning, trying to figure out what's going to happen next. Describe for us, if you will, what was at the crux of your relationship with Pete.
Well, Pete was 21 years older than me. He was known all over the United States, and I was the young guy. And Pete was a very structured, summa cum laude type of process thinker, which was great. But I was more of I guess you would call it, sort of intuitive type of thinker. And so when we did things together, he would let me do like all the execution, because for a while he sort of like try and rehearse what we do, and I said, don't worry about it. I'll walk in the room. I'll know.
I got this, right?
I got this. Let's just, it'll happen, and it does. So we were a very good team for a very long time, over 30 years. And sort of incredibly productive and easy to deal with, because we each approach the world, somewhat differently.
Except when you guys went out on your own, and that first time when you were looking for some money.
What you find is that the world is not always waiting for you. In fact, sometimes the world doesn't even respond to you. So when we started, we set out about 500 letters expecting people we used to do business with to call us and give us an order, and the phone never rang.
It's funny, in your book, too, you write, you can't learn to be a manager, but you can learn to be an entrepreneur.
You can't learn.
I'm sorry. You can't learn. You can learn to be. Let's try that.
You can learn to be a manager,
but you can't learn to be an entrepreneur.
Because being an entrepreneur involves seeing a lot of things simultaneously, putting them together, and have the desire and the ability to just say, okay, this is going to work. I'm just going out there to make it happen. There is no fallback.
Yeah.
There is no net, when you're up on the high wire. And, the only reason you do that is that you are sure. Now, the fact that 9 out of 10 new businesses fails means that it is a delusional exercise, right?
Right.
So to be that delusional and go out when the percentages are against you takes a certain kind of person who believes that they've figured it out.
To do it anyway.
Well, they don't think they're at risk. People who do these, sort of books or whatever, or interview entrepreneurs and talk about, you really like risk. Nobody likes risk. Nobody tries to fail. And so I've always found that whenever I do anything, whether it's a new charitable thing or whether it's, expanding different parts of the firm, I like to be completely convinced that whatever we're doing is going to work. And I usually can explain to anybody why I think what I think, and it's rational. But interestingly, hardly anyone ever responds and competes with us when we start because people are comfortable doing what they do. So you can tell them we're doing something else, and they go, that's interesting, and then they just go back to what they're doing. And it's part of the human condition.
Coming up, more from our conversation with Steve Schwarzman. He hung out with us for a while.
He did. We covered a lot of topics, including populism and the U.S.-China trade war. This is Bloomberg BusinessWeek.
Welcome back to Bloomberg BusinessWeek. I'm Jason Kelly.
And I'm Carol Massar. You can listen to us on the radio on SiriusXM Channel 119 and on AM 1130 in New York, 106.1 in Boston, 99.1 FM in Washington, D.C.
AM 960 in the Bay Area, in London on DAB Digital, and through the Bloomberg Business app. Well, let's continue our conversation. The latest edition of BusinessWeek talks with Steve Schwarzman.
That's right, the private equity titan. Well, he has one of the closest relationships to Beijing of any American executive. It's rooted both in business and also the founding there of his academic program, Schwarzman Scholars.
He's also a prominent Trump advisor. He's known the president for a long time, and he served as something of an intermediary between the Chinese government during this ongoing trade conflict.
It's more interesting than two people because China has been the most rapidly growing country probably in world history over a 40-year period. And they did that with enormous energy, central planning, and also adopting a lot of things that emerging markets countries do, which is hiding behind high tariff walls, closing its markets, and if not closed, not making them as accessible as the developed world does, and doing different things with intellectual property. And the U.S. In the 19th century sort of did the same thing. We were a poor little country, and we found a way to use tariffs to protect ourselves. At a certain point, that creates imbalances around the world. So now that China's got $3 trillion of reserves, it's the biggest producer and fulfiller of jobs in the world. So jobs have moved from the developed world to China. Wealth has moved, and the global financial crisis basically created problems for the developed world. So now we have roughly half of the people, for example, in the United States, who have income insufficiency. They're in a bad way, and that creates populism. And when domestic candidates for being attacked don't result in change for the people who are in trouble, they find a foreign devil. And I was pretty sure it was going to be China for those reasons. So in effect, China recognizes that the circumstances of the world have changed. But like all people who have a really good deal, why would you change it? And you only change it because there's pressure, and the change ends up being in their interest. On the other hand, there are people in their country who don't believe that. They just want things the way they are. Remember, people don't like to change. And so here we have the developed world represented by the United States who wants them to change. So it's a very interesting thing where China knows it has to change. The U.S. wants them to change. It should be easy, except it's not easy because people don't like giving up advantage. And on the U.S. side, they would want to accomplish this rebalancing as quickly and as thoroughly as they can. So what's happening over the last 2.5 years, roughly, is these two giant countries, which together have somewhere between 35 and 40% of the world's economy. So this is like the two parents fighting, and the children, are like hiding. And they're upset. That's the rest of the world, which is slowing trade. But long-term, potential decoupling of these two giant countries actually results in lower growth for everyone.
Right. And how much do you worry about that? How much do you worry about that decoupling? Because that seems to be the biggest worry in the world right now, is that mom and dad will come together
A splitting of the world, essentially.
Right. Well, partly that's happening because there hasn't been the overlap. And I think that because ultimately, people are rational on a certain level, that as these two countries see that that's not working for them, that they'll come to a table, which is what's happening now for the third time.
Right.
And they're doing it not to just be helpful. They're doing it as they recognize that the short term in China can remain fine with policy adjustments, but they're borrowing from their future. And long term, if you really go off on your own and decouple and have a slower growing world, what's the win in that? That's not a win.
What can you, Steve Schwarzman, do to help this along?
Well, I think there are a lot of people who know both countries, and I think it's important that people understand where this is ultimately going, which is not in their interest. And ultimately, I believe that people will act in their self-interest, and there will be an adjustment. No one can predict the way sort of the media wants what's going to happen in October, and it's sort of in the I could guess, but it's a who knows, because it's really about primarily it's about China. They have their hardliners, they have their reformers. What do they actually want to put on a table?
And President Xi has to balance that right now.
Well, somebody has to balance it.
Yeah.
And in May, when the trade talks basically were, I was going to say suspended, but at that point they were ended. The balance of reform versus, sort of the harder line position, the harder line people, in effect had more influence. Now, as it's all becoming more complicated, not just because of trade, other decisions that China has made over the last 2 or 3 years are creating more complexity there. They've got other things going on as well that put pressure on them. That they're coming and saying, let's see if we can do something, is sensible. You can't get caught up in two people, or any administration, because if we don't solve this problem, the attitude of the Democrats towards China is if not identical to the current administration, it's pretty close. So I think China recognizes that this is a structural issue. It's not one U.S. president, and so getting something to lower the temperature and helping growth globally is in everybody's interest.
And be sure to catch our entire conversation with Steve Schwarzman by checking out our BW Extra podcast, because we talked about a lot of things, including the family business when he was growing up.
Well, a bit of a disagreement that he had with his father about the family linens business and how much it should expand. It's a fascinating tale.
It is indeed. Coming up, though, General Motors CEO Mary Barra, she is electrifying the car maker, but first, she's got to settle a strike.
Plus, what was Buyer thinking as lawsuits over the weed killer Roundup pile up? We look back at its $63 billion purchase of Monsanto.
This is Bloomberg BusinessWeek. Welcome back to Bloomberg BusinessWeek. I'm Carol Massar.
And I'm Jason Kelly. Still ahead in this week's issue, Trump Care. Under the current administration, health insurance that doesn't cover the bills has flooded the market.
Plus, how Trump's FDA gave vaping room to breathe and to grow.
We begin with this week's cover story, and a top news story this week. General Motors. Union workers walked off the production line and shut down the automaker for the first time in a dozen years.
Yeah, workers there that made concessions to get the company through bankruptcy during the crisis. Well, now they want to see quid pro quo as GM posts near record profits for 3 straight years.
Here's Detroit Bureau Chief David Welch with a look at GM and its CEO, Mary Barra.
what GM has been doing for the past really 5 or 6 years, they've been downsizing things in the core business. They sold their European operations. They fled Russia. They fled some of the Southeast Asian markets, India. They've downsized by getting rid of certain models, certain plants in the U.S. that make small cars or thinly profitable models. That's where the union gets angry. But what GM's really doing here, what Mary Barra's strategy really is getting out of low margin or money losing businesses that GM and other car makers have just participated in for decades, simply out of corporate inertia and because car companies always thought they had to sell every vehicle to everybody across the globe. She's getting out of that stuff. And with the money she saves, she's putting it into electric cars, autonomous vehicles, because she sees that as the real future of the company. And it really is, let's call it strategically, and then in terms of actual capital spending, financially transformative for the company if she can pull this off. Because the end game for Barra is sell cars to individual owners where you make a lot of money.
Right.
Build a service, robo-taxis, so you're selling transportation by the ride with a self-driving electric taxi at some point to other people. GM will become part manufacturer, part service. If all of this happens, it'll take time, but if she succeeds, that's what's going on.
But your point is she's plowing a lot of money into, the GM, what she expects to be the GM of the future. You've got a company that's making money, right? And I think workers at this point, David, are saying, wait a minute, we should get some of that as well.
Yeah, what I really loved about working on this story is that it sort of touches on a big point within the American zeitgeist right now, which is questioning, has capitalism gone too far? And when Mary Barra cuts models or plants because even if they make money, they don't make great money, getting out of low margin businesses, or she moves a model like, say, the Chevy Blazer to Mexico. SUVs make good money. You don't need to make it with Mexican labor to make that profitably. The union reacts by saying, wait a second, you've made record profits, what's called record operating profits for the last 3 years. The company is guided to match or beat that this year, so the money's coming in. Why do you have to keep cutting? Why do you have to keep sending vehicles to Mexico? You need to take care of us. That's what that fight is really about.
Another big business story in this week's issue is all about Bayer. 2 months after clinching its $63 billion purchase of Monsanto, the German conglomerate faced a protracted legal battle over the U.S. company's Roundup weed killer.
Yeah, Jason, and that has opened the door to countless more lawsuits, which begs the question, why, oh why, did Buyer buy Monsanto? Here's more from reporter Tim Lowe in Munich.
In around the 2014-2015 timeframe, Bayer was looking to make some sort of a deal. And the question was, are we going to continue this evolution that they'd been on into more and more into healthcare, pharmaceuticals? Or were they going to zag and do something, that was a bit more conglomerate-like? It's a company that for generations had been quite conglomerate-heavy. And most investors thought they were going to go healthcare, going to go pharma. And Werner Baumann, the CEO of Bayer now, he came up with this plan to go after Monsanto, and he steered it through. And it was bold, it was big, and it's been pretty contentious here in Germany and abroad.
All right, so let's fast forward a little bit. So they make this purchase. How much of the potential legal problems because of Monsanto's Roundup weed killer were known at that time?
Yeah, well, it depends who you ask. If you talk to the plaintiff attorneys in the U.S., it was all there. The key thing that had happened, this was a year prior to Bayer's attempt to buy Monsanto. So it was in 2015. This organization called IARC, which is a part of the World Health Organization and researches, what causes cancer. They had identified glyphosate, which is the key chemical inside Roundup, the weed killer. That they had identified glyphosate as probably carcinogenic to humans, meaning it could cause cancer if you use it. Global regulatory bodies from the EPA in the US to Europe, Japan, all over have for years allowed glyphosate to be used, and Bayer was, and they continue to argue that that's the winning argument argument, and therefore this was a fine decision to buy Monsanto. They claim they did all sorts of the due diligence, and they concluded the legal risk from Roundup was low. Well, it wasn't low. It's been massive. There's now more than 18,000 lawsuits against the company in the U.S., and they've lost 3 of 3 trials, and to the tune of one jury awarded $2 billion to plaintiffs. The figure came down a little bit, but you know, it's big.
Still ahead, collateral damage in Trump's trade war. Farmers, are they still on his side?
Plus, we look at the world of vaping, how a regulatory delay allowed that market to take off. This is Bloomberg BusinessWeek. Welcome back to Bloomberg BusinessWeek. I'm Jason Kelly.
And I'm Carol Massar. Join us for Bloomberg BusinessWeek every day on the radio starting at 2 p.m. Wall Street time. You can also catch up on our daily show by listening to our podcast at Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, and of course at Bloomberg.com.
And you can find us online at businessweek.com and through our mobile app.
In this week's economics section, the U.S.-China trade war has cut off American farmers from one of their most important export markets. So, Trump's solution, $28 billion in aid.
But is that enough to keep rural voters loyal? Here's this week's Business Week explainer.
Their collateral damage in President Trump's trade war with China. Farmers have been slammed by China's decision to slash U.S. imports. But the president reminds American farmers that he's trying to make it up to them. They're getting $28 billion in aid over a 2-year period. That's more than twice what U.S. taxpayers wound up paying for the bailout of the auto industry. And that doesn't include an additional $10.5 billion in federally subsidized crop insurance payments. Net farm income is projected to be down 29% this year from 2013. Farm debt is projected to reach a record $416 billion in 2019. Still, the Trump aid payments may cover more than half of farmers' trade war losses, and 58% of those surveyed expect another round of trade aid next year. All that appears to have kept farmers on Trump's side. One poll shows 67% of farmers backing the president. That's up from 60% a year ago.
From one hot-button political and economic issue to another, we turn now to health care. The Trump administration's moves to weaken the Affordable Care Act have companies cashing in.
And as a result, Jason, many Americans are now learning that their new health insurance doesn't cover the bills. Investigative reporter Zeke Fox found out how it's impacting one family in particular.
Her husband woke up one morning and couldn't get out of bed, and he asked her to pray with him. And instead, their son called 911. The ambulance came, and it turned out he'd had a heart attack. Was discharged from the hospital. He's doing well now. And Marcia thought, her bills were covered. She started to get things in the mail saying, pay this, pay that. But as you know,
you get bills and you're like, the insurance company hasn't caught up yet, right?
Yeah, exactly. But eventually she figured out, no, actually, she owes about $250,000. She called her insurance company and they said, yeah, that's right. We're not going to pay.
All right. How can that be right? Because she was understanding she had hospital benefits and coverage. She had a deductible of about $7,500.
Exactly. So she thought that the deductible was all she'd owe. But it turned out that she had what's known as a short-term medical plan. And this is a kind of policy that's exempt from the requirements of the Affordable Care Act. So her policy had all sorts of limitations that she was not aware of, such as it covered a maximum of $5,000 for surgeries. So anyone who's ever seen a hospital bill knows that
covers barely anything.
Right. It's going to be way more than that. So,
right. So for any surgery her family had, it was $5,000 max that would be covered.
That's what the policy says. I mean, the limitations are so weird that it's hard to believe. But when she called, they said, yeah, we won't be paying any. We've paid a few $1,000s of this bill, and we won't be paying any more.
Zeke, I feel like so many people are listening to this or watching this, and they're saying, oh, yeah, well, did you read the fine print? Tell us about the process in terms of maybe things in the fine print or something that the broker maybe was supposed to tell them and maybe didn't.
So Mauricia says that the broker told her this was comprehensive insurance and that it was comparable to what she had before.
Right.
The broker wasn't willing to speak with me, so I don't know what her side of the story is. I assumed that she would say that she informed Mauricia of the limitations.
Right.
But the interesting thing about this is that since the Affordable Care Act passed, I think people have come to believe that there's a bunch of rules about health insurance and that any policy you buy is going to meet certain minimums. But it turns out there's this other kind of insurance called short-term medical that does not have to follow these rules. They can exclude people with pre-existing conditions. They can put a cap on how much they'll pay. And the Trump administration is actually promoting these kinds of policies as a way of giving people more choices and cheaper insurance.
From healthcare to health concerns, this week the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention launched its Emergency Operations Center to look into vaping lung injuries. And then you had New York State imposing a statewide emergency ban on flavored e-cigarettes.
Here's healthcare reporter Anna Edney in Washington on the vaping controversy and why the industry grew so fast.
It goes back a couple of years when the FDA, the commissioner then was Scott Gottlieb, and he wanted to do implement this strategy that would not only look at e-cigarettes but also would look at cigarettes and try to get people off of tobacco altogether. So he was looking at this idea where you would reduce the amount of nicotine in cigarettes, and at the same time he wanted to give room for e-cigarettes to grow as sort of an alternative. While you're maybe getting adults off smoking, you're giving them something to use instead, but it hasn't worked out that way. What we've seen is nothing yet has happened officially on the nicotine front in cigarettes, but at the same time, the vaping industry has taken off and you have more kids hooked now than ever before.
And so what happens next, Anna? Who has the next move here? Because industry obviously has quite a stake in this. The president himself is weighing in via tweet and in public comments, seeming to make it sort of personal in a lot of ways. And then you have, as Carol alluded to, multiple regulators and departments of the government trying to figure out how to deal with this. Who's got the next move?
Well, I think the next move is looking like it will come from the FDA again, but this will be directed this time by the president and by HHS Secretary Azar, who last week, both said that they were going to look into taking e-cigarettes off the market, flavored ones, so anything except tobacco flavor, off the market, and they would have to reapply to the FDA to get approval to resume sales again. So, we're looking to that to be the next policy that comes out that could have a huge effect on the industry. If it happens the way that Trump and Azar said, it could happen very quickly. And that's something that we'll have to kind of see what exactly the details are, because we haven't seen those yet.
Well, and your point is that there's been, delay after delay, and here we are, a couple of things going on, right? We have an acting FDA commissioner. It's going to take time to nominate somebody, get them confirmed, and then you also have the 2020 elections, which are going to keep lawmakers and everyone kind of busy. So we could see even more delays in any kind of true regulatory framework actually happening when it comes to e-cigarettes.
Yes, it's really tough to get major policy proposals through when you have an acting FDA commissioner. It helps a lot to have someone who has Senate confirmation, and we're not even sure exactly who Trump is going to nominate for the permanent position, whether it would be the acting commissioner or someone else he's been talking to as well. So there's a lot of pieces at play here that don't indicate a whole lot of backing.
And we should remind you, Michael Bloomberg, the founder and majority owner of Bloomberg LP, recently announced a $160 million initiative pushing to ban flavored e-cigarettes.
All right, coming up next, nothing is immune from the sharing economy, and that includes, check this out, legal advice.
Plus, virtual reality dining. This blew my mind. Is it art or just delicious nonsense? This is Bloomberg BusinessWeek.
back to Bloomberg BusinessWeek. I'm Carol Massar.
And I'm Jason Kelly. You can also listen to us on the radio on Sirius XM Channel 119, also AM 1130 in New York, 1061 in Boston, 99.1 FM in Washington, D.C.
AM 960 in the Bay Area, over in London on DAB Digital and on the Bloomberg Business app.
On the radio, we cover topics from the magazine and beyond, like this story, part of Bloomberg's participation in the Covering Climate Now initiative. That's a global collaboration of more than 220 news outlets to highlight climate change and the efforts to combat it, led by Columbia Journalism School.
Here's reporter Brian Eckhouse in our radio studio in New York with what's behind the world's biggest climate victory: capitalism.
The cost of solar panels, the cost of wind turbines came down a lot. Part of it was, yes, there were subsidies from China and from the US, and there's still subsidies in a lot of parts of the world, but we're now seeing in places like Spain, Italy, even China, definitely India, where these plants are no longer subsidized. And when governments or utilities or corporations look for new power sources, they look for wind and solar.
What could trip this up? Because you do have, this is ultimately turned into something of a political issue. Maybe not ultimately, it always has been a political issue. The whole idea of coal jobs and coal-powered jobs, for lack of a better term, was a key part of the constituency in 2016 for President Trump. Do politics enter into this at this point?
It might. The administration has tried to find ways to prop up struggling coal and nuclear plants, and some states, including some blue states, have done things to subsidize nuclear around the country.
Right. You think about the impact, right, on our utility infrastructure to some extent, where, coal has been such a big part of it. These are changing dynamics for this industry and these companies.
Absolutely. And in parts of the Midwest, Pennsylvania, Ohio, they're sitting on some of the strongest shale gas reserves in the country.
Right.
So a lot of the coal plants that are coming off the grid now are being replaced by gas. The question really is, we're going to see renewables replace the gas soon, or in 30, 40, 50 years? That's a big question in the U.S.
Renewables disrupting how we get our power.
And the sharing economy turning just about every industry on its head, and that includes law.
In the technology section, editor Max Chafkin visits a startup that's going to rent you a lawyer.
Twitch founder Justin Kan, who, if you're sort of on the older millennial side, you may remember as the reality TV star of Justin.tv. This was like a very early Web 2.0 thing.
Put a camera, tracked everything he did.
Put a camera on his head. Yeah. He walked around San Francisco doing 20-year-old coder stuff. It wasn't a huge hit, but he's back with a new company called Atrium, which is basically trying to, as you said, kind of bring the sharing economy to legal services, to replace your corporate lawyer with a $500 a month subscription.
I want to talk about that business, but the reason we care, though, is that crazy thing, putting the camera, which wasn't necessarily a big hit, eventually kind of morphed into Twitch, which did become kind of a big deal.
Yeah, and so Twitch also sounded kind of crazy, because who wants to watch, other people play video games? Turns out lots of people.
Right.
Twitch helped create the whole sort of notion of esports and sold itself to Amazon for $1 billion. It's now part of Amazon. Part of this vibrant, growing industry. Justin Kan kind of wended his way. He was an investor for a while. And then, as he explained to me in an interview, basically started wondering why he was spending so much money on legal services. He realized he'd spent, something like $2 million over the previous decade and didn't feel like he was necessarily getting enough for it.
Okay, so enter Atrium. So tell me how this works, because it's a little bit, Max, of a tiered service, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty similar to WeWork, honestly. $500, and you get access to an hour a month of general legal advice. So you have a normal corporate lawyer who comes from a big corporate law firm who gets paid a very high hourly wage, et cetera, et cetera. And then you get this software platform, which supposedly is going to automate a lot of these functions. So they walked me through, an offer letter where you type in the employee's name, you check a few boxes, and then out comes a sort of legal document. Or they can do it for an NDA. And the idea is that's going to expand to include lots of stuff. So in the long run, a lot of the legal services are going to be handled by software, by a computer.
Right.
Your corporate lawyer is going to be spending way fewer hours doing general lawyer stuff.
I feel like some of it makes a lot of sense, because we even talk about, legal work and getting a mortgage or something. So much of it is formulaic that there's no reason why you can't kind of involve some types of technology or computer system to kind of walk us through it.
Yeah, and we've seen this kind of on the sort of personal end of legal services.
Exactly.
LegalZoom has been around for a long time. There are websites that will help you prepare a will. There's also kind of an interesting startup that's doing this in small claims court called Do Not Pay. So it's happening in all sorts of areas. Atrium's kind of interesting because it's going after sort of like the core of the legal industry, these big corporate law firms that, generate enormous amounts of revenue and pay these, very well-educated lawyers, in some cases, millions of dollars a year.
In Pursuits this week, it's all about food.
It's a lot of fun. Editor Kate Crater writes about a new trend, VR dining, and yes, it's exactly what it sounds like eating while wearing a virtual reality headset. Go figure.
VR dining is something that we looked at really skeptically. An author pitched it to us, and it's been something that's been really slow to take hold, like dining in the dark. I don't know if you've ever been subjected to it, but it's not fun.
Doesn't sound fun at all.
So don't do it.
Where's my food?
I know, exactly, as you're like spilling it down your front. But VR dining is something that's starting to catch on. It was a big deal at this food conference in South Korea earlier this year, and now it's actually coming to New York. There's a company called Aero Banquets, RMX, that's bringing a situation to the James Beard House, which is right here in New York City. And for $125, you can put on a VR headset and have like 5 courses. And it's going to be like Fast and Furious, but you might be looking at a barn and tasting cheese.
Right.
Like that.
I mean, that was the thing that I was trying to get my head around, almost literally and figuratively, as I was reading this, that you're not looking at what you're eating, you're looking at something else. And so you're so informed. Your senses are essentially informed by what you're experiencing through your eyes, not necessarily what you would be experiencing if you were just looking at the food.
Exactly. You're not looking at the Platonic ideal of like a cow marching through a field. You're looking at something that is going to expand your senses somehow, and whether you buy into it or not remains to be seen.
Did you do it?
I haven't done it, no.
Okay.
I've done some version of it actually with food, and I have to say I'm not a fan because I think of eating as the best social experience, a really good way to have a conversation. And if you're arrested by, if you have this arresting image in front of you, I think it's a lot going on.
Sometimes simple is nice,
Well,
right?
and it would feel weird if we all went out to dinner and like put on masks and then, I don't know.
Exactly.
But it is interesting that James Beard Foundation is getting involved,
well, I think
right?
it's very smart for them because you know what, you always have to find a way, like they're sitting on pricey real estate in Greenwich Village and they had this floor that was unoccupied, so they get to trick it out and move forward into the 21st century. So I think it's actually a very smart idea for them, and it's worth seeing what's behind it. Gail Simmons, who's a great Top Chef judge, is narrating the experience, and so I think people should try it, like whether they want to go back, I don't know.
Bloomberg BusinessWeek is available on newsstands now.
Also online at businessweek.com and on our mobile app.
And check out our daily BusinessWeek podcast. That's available at Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, Bloomberg.com, wherever you get your podcasts.
And our BusinessWeek Extra podcast as well. More Bloomberg Television starts now.